So Marcus Chen from Oxford will talk about the emergence of cash distributions in the euergetism of the Greek East under Roman rule. So you have the floor for 25 minutes. I will go and sit in the room just to enjoy the presentation. If you see me coming back, it means it's you have to come to a conclusion, okay? So it's body language, you know. Well, so you have the floor. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me, and Andoni for inviting me to this wonderful conference. And sorry, I cannot speak Spanish at all. It'll be completely English. So this paper is about a widely attested but slightly neglected cultural practice in the Roman Imperial East, the distribution of coins by benefactors as a form of cash gift. One example is in a late 2nd century inscription, as you see, honoring the Stephanophoros Antaios of Syros. Alongside the distribution of commodities like grain, oil, or bread, such monetary distributions took place in different contexts, like festivals, the dedication of an honorific statue, or as part of a promise of an elected office holder, as in this case. And the majority of examples date to the late 1st to mid-3rd centuries CE. So scholarship has mainly studied the distribution aspect of these monetary distributions, showing trends towards more hierarchy in the social structure of the polis. However, there has been less attention to the monetary aspect, the fact that benefactors were distributing coins. Moreover, they represent a development in habit, because euergetic cash handouts are not attested in our evidence before the imperial period, more or less. My paper today will examine some of the contextual reasons for this change in 3 parts. Firstly, I will survey the earlier history of public distributions before the 1st century CE, showing the a link between the Principate and the emergence of cash handouts. Then I will explore the role of imperial ideology and some changes in monetary history in the Roman East as further influential factors. As a phenomenon known almost entirely through public inscriptions, this should also say something about the impact of Roman rule on epigraphic culture and civic space, which is the subject of our colloquium. So the near total absence of cash handouts before the imperial period, as seen in the graph, deserves some attention, some description and explanation. This is not actually entirely true, because the very first instance we have dates to the mid-6th century BC, outside the scope of the graph, that I could find, when King Croesus of Lydia distributed 2 gold statues to each Delphian citizen after receiving an oracle predicting his success against Persia. But this was during an early phase of the history of coinage, and was perhaps an extension of the use of coinage as a means of paying soldiers. The important point is that it was not followed for the next 6 centuries. No Persian or Hellenistic king, so far as I know, ever conducted a similar individualized distribution. When we look at the Greek cities that encountered and adopted coinage from the 6th century onwards, the same is more or less true. Communal feasts were a feature of the archaic period, like feasts for victorious athletes, but no distributions of cash are known. The Athenian Chaemon famously opened his house to his fellow citizens and shared the produce of his gardens, but did not distribute cash. Indeed, throughout the history of classical Athens, when public distributions were held at sacrificial feasts, we only find distributions of sacrificial meat, but not of coins. Of course, the Athenians did individually receive sums of money from the state from the mid-5th century onwards, when they served as jurors or attended the assembly and later the theater. But these distributions of money were organized by the state and not by individuals. When we enter the Hellenistic period, our epigraphic record increases dramatically, but essentially presents a similar pattern. Public distributions being confined to distributions of commodities, and monetary distributions to individuals, when they are attested at all, were conducted by civic governments. So for example, the Milesians distributed 6 hemi-hectare of grain to each citizen on the birthday of Eumenes II. Elsewhere, we find distributions of sacrificial meat, grain, and wine. In one case from Lampsacus, we find a distribution of 7 drachmas to the citizens and some obols in lieu of a grain handout, but this was organized by the city and not an individual benefactor. A major feature of civic culture in the Hellenistic and especially later Hellenistic periods, from the later 2nd century onwards, as we have heard already, and is well known, was the ever more prominent role of civic benefactors. Some of these also carried out public distributions, and in more innovative ways than before. For one, there was a tendency to include a wider range of social groups to sacrificial feasts, sometimes beyond citizen groups alone. For instance, several archons on the island of Amorgos distributed meat at a festival to Athena Itonia, not only to citizens but also to resident non-citizens and foreigners. The wealthy citizen of Priene, Moskion, son of Kaidemos, whose honorific decree is probably the longest known in the Hellenistic world, hosted citizens, free non-citizens, foreigners, and even freedmen and house slaves at his opening distribution of sweet wine, glychismos, as a Stephanophoros. Moskion exemplifies the trends of the late Hellenistic period, found across the Aegean and Western Asia Minor, more social groups being involved and new types of commodity being distributed, in this case sweet wine, which may have been previously distributed by the state alone. In other cases, we also find unusual things like porridge, and in the context of gymnasia, we also find different types of olive oil. Moreover, we find that feasts and distributions were held in new venues, such as gymnasia and during the consecration ceremony of an honorific statue. But the glaring point in this survey, however, is that while wealthy late Hellenistic benefactors included more types of social groups beyond citizens, gave out unusual and possibly exotic commodities, they did not give out coins. Moskion at Priene did distribute half a medimnos of grain to each citizen, a sign that public distributions were always calculated in numerical terms. Sacrificial meat was also weighed according to monetary standards, like another Prienian who handed out a Euboean mina of beef, about 430 grams, to each member of the gymnasium. But no late Hellenistic benefactors actually bridged the gap to hand out money itself. There are inevitably a few handful of borderline cases, as I show here, but without going into detail, I think it suffices to say that these do not show clear examples of monetary distribution, or their dating is disputed. With all that said, the first evidence I could find for cash handout conducted by a civic benefactor seems to date to the early 1st century CE. This was actually 2 benefactors, Chrysaor and his wife Pamphile at Stratonicaia in Caria, who handed out 10 drachmas to each citizen, 16 to each councillor, and 5 drachmas to each non-citizen inhabitant of the city. And over the 1st century CE, we find other cases emerging at Akraphia, Beroia, Smyrna, Iassos, Ephesus, Miletus, Aphrodisias, Achaemenea, Patara. So a large enough, I think, list to show that a new kind of trend had begun. In some of these cases, cash handouts were even made of their own accord as benefactions in their own right, being held at the honorific statues or the tombs of benefactors. This shows that they were increasingly normalized over the 1st century. By the early 2nd century, Pliny even mentions and criticizes the practice of cash handouts in a letter to Trajan. But this sort of pushback by the literati did not have any impact. As we saw earlier, the numbers of euergetic cash handouts more than triples over the 2nd and 3rd centuries, from even the 1st century CE, as we enter kind of an age of numismatic euergetism. So far then, we have seen that you've individualized public distributions in the classical and Hellenistic periods consisted of distributions of commodities like grain, wine, and oil, but not of coined money. And this is true even in the later Hellenistic period when wealthy benefactors become more prominent and influence the character of distributions in new ways. We've also seen that the first verifiable cash handout by a citizen benefactor dates to the early 1st century CE. So I should stress, first of all, that the emergence of cash handouts did not mark, I don't think, a fundamental change in the ethics of euergetism as a system of symbolic gift exchange. Giving out gifts of money instead of just grain or oil did not make euergetism more monetary or calculating overall, even if it did help to define differences in social status more easily. These internal changes in civic societies towards greater hierarchization were already happening in the late Hellenistic period before the first cash handouts. Moreover, in the imperial period, distributions of grain and other commodities also continue, as we saw earlier in the second slide. It's not working. Sorry. Cash handouts were therefore a reflection of broader social changes, but not the source of significant change in themselves. In short, what I think is interesting about them is that they show changing attitudes to coinage and its social and political use. In this regard, it is noteworthy that the emergence of cash handouts coincides with the onset of the Principate, the subject of second section. As is well known, the Roman emperors handed out congiaria, distributions of cash gifts to the population at Rome throughout the imperial period. The first to do so in lieu of the traditional congiaria in wine and oil was actually Julius Caesar, who donated 400 sesterci to the plebs Romana in 46 BC. He was then followed by Augustus, who distributed coins on a number of occasions, as documented in chapter 15 of the Res Gestae, and the Julio-Claudian and Flavian emperors followed him afterwards. By the time of Chrysaor and Pamphile, our first example, when they held their distribution at Stratonicaya, the distribution of cash to individual recipients by the princeps, the emperor, was a fairly established practice, even if perhaps not older than a century. I would suggest, therefore, that this imperial precedent was in fact one of the inspirations for the practice at the local level of civic communities in the Greek East. There is actual evidence, in a sense, for the transmission of knowledge of this, of cash congiaria at Rome, because we have obviously 3 copies of Augustus' Res Gestae inscribed in Galatia, and 1 in Ankara on the wall of the Temple of Augustus. Here it is notable that a list of the benefactions of the Galatian high priests was inscribed around the same time as the Res Gestae was inscribed, and the commissioners of the copy of the Res Gestae seem to have wanted to set Augustus's achievements as an example in some sense to the local elite. Moreover, the Greek version was inscribed at eye level and was meant to reach a wider audience. Chapter 15, listing the cash handouts, was inscribed at the end of a column, probably making it even more accessible. It also translated the monetary sums into denarii, the main unit of account in the Greek East by this point, while the Latin version actually uses sesterci, showing that these were meant to be received and perhaps serve as an inspiration for similar benefactions. Anyhow, the existence of copies of the Res Gestae in themselves suggests how knowledge of imperial distributions of cash at Rome may have been spread out. Furthermore, in many of the early cases of cash handouts, these were made in relation to honors to emperors. Chrysaor and Pamphile distributing cash to sponsor individual sacrifices to the imperial house, as we saw, and in the other cases in the 1st century, Potens of Iasos and Licinius at Xanthos distributed cash gifts on imperial birthdays, and Aristocles Molossos at Aphrodisias was a priest of the imperial cult. It should also be stressed that Chrysaor and Pamphile's public presentation as an euergetic couple may have imitated or appropriated the public image of the ruling imperial couple like Augustus and Livia, and the stress on womanhood that Livia promoted at Rome. The transmission of knowledge of imperial congiaria through the local elite is not surprising, as these were the main conduits between Roman power and civic communities. But we should not neglect the role of resident Roman communities, many of whose members would have been aware of and possibly even personally benefited from the cash gifts of the princeps and earlier Julius Caesar. Some local notables may have even sought to ingratiate themselves through Romanizing practices. For instance, Ecleanax at Kyme in the late 1st century BC, who often included resident Romans in his distributions, carried out a so-called casting out ceremony, a diarifa, a ritual whose precise nature is unclear, but which may have imitated the spasio misilium, the throwing out of tokens that we know existed later at imperial Rome. Moreover, some of the early distributors of coins were of Italian background, like Potens of Iasos and several others at Ephesus. Potens of Iasos distributed 25 denarii to councillors while they were reclining at a banquet, a practice that seems to recall the handing out of sportuli at private feasts of the Roman elite. Another benefactor, Flavius Praxias at Acmonea in Phrygia, distributed cash to those who were present, the parontes, and the councillors who were reclining, kataklenomenoi, in Roman style. This seems to recall a distinction between the praesentes and recumbentes, which was also found in the public sportuli of the western provinces. But these cases from Iasos and Acmonea are actually earlier than the first cases in the western provinces. It may be that geographical distance meant that benefactors of Italian origin felt a stronger need to emphasize their Romanness than further west. The fact also that many resident Romans were of a mercantile commercial background who had accumulated wealth primarily in cash and not just landed property may also have been a factor in making it more acceptable to distribute coins rather than just commodities. If it is true then that the example of an imperial power could shape local practice, this would also explain why citizen benefactors did not hold cash handouts before the imperial period. The earlier Hellenistic and Persian kings never distributed coins in this way, and they never had the same sort of euergetic relationships with their capital cities as the Roman emperors did at Rome. We saw that the earliest case of a cash handout was actually that of a king, Croesus of Lydia, but this is slightly unusual from an earlier period of coinage and not an example that was followed by later kings. So insofar as the euergetic behavior of local notables was influenced by the example of higher powers, this example existed in the early empire, but not before it. So while the practice among the emperors of distributing coins as a benefaction may have inspired the local elite, it's also worth wondering, I think, whether there's anything specific about the coins which may tell us about how they came to be a medium of benefaction. We might ask what sort of coins were actually distributed at cash handouts. It's our third section of the paper. Many of the texts over the first 2 3rd centuries that record them include the currencies in which the coins were given. We can organize them in a graph like so. Small fractions and bronze currencies like obols and Roman arsaria are rare, and so are gold currencies like the aureus. On the contrary, the vast majority of distributions were made in silver currency, the denarius or the drachma, and sometimes the so-called Attic drachma. These patterns reflect probably the actual currency that was used, because small fractions and bronze, not often, because it would have been too cumbersome to distribute large amounts in small change. And gold is also rare because sums handed out were rarely large enough to need them, because an aureus equated to about 25 denarii, and most cash handouts were below that amount. Thus, we should imagine that most of these distributions in the imperial period were made in silver currency. When we look at the history of the minting of silver coinage in Greece and Asia Minor, we also notice important changes that coincided with the onset of the Principate and emergence of cash handouts. We find that local communities and federations moved irreversibly over the 1st century BC, and especially in the later 1st century BC, towards the use of the denarius and Roman monetary standards. While local coinages struck with local types or on non-Roman standards like the Attic and Aeginetan weight standards or the weight standard of the Attalid Sistophoros, were gradually phased out or adapted to Roman standards. In Greece, the Thessalian League's silver status, the new-style tetradrachms of Athens, the late post-146 coinage of the Achaean League, ended production around 40 BC, while the denarius became the main silver currency and unit of account. In Macedonia, similarly, the pre-existing coinages of 150 to 50 BC were essentially replaced by the denarius, which dominates hordes into the imperial period. In Asia Minor, the story is more complicated, but a similar trend is observable. The Attalid Sistophoros, corresponding to 3/4 of an Attic tetradrachm, was maintained as the main silver currency after the provincialization of Asia in 129. But from the mid-1st century BC, the weight of the Sistophoros was aligned with the denarius, one Sistophoric dram becoming about 3/4 of a denarius, becoming essentially a Roman currency. At the same time, the large numbers of cities that had minted in the 2nd century BC, minted silver currency, gradually decreases over the 1st century, or have their weights aligned to the Roman standard. While no cities in Achaia and Macedonia struck silver coinage after the late 1st century, a handful did actually do so in Asia Minor, like in Lycia and Chios, Rhodes, Stratodicaea, Milaza, Tabai. But however, even so, these coins were struck on the standard of the Romanized Sistophoros, or the standard of the denarius, and functioned only within a Roman monetary zone. The basic point then is that by the early 1st century CE, civic communities no longer produced their own silver coinage, except for a handful of cities, and these only for a short time longer. The reasons for this change are complex, and I don't want to get into them now, and related to broader monetary history. What it signified, however, I think was the end of a long tradition dating back to the 6th century of silver coinage being an important medium for cities to express their political and cultural identities, where its minting was a guarded privilege of civic governments. The Roman takeover meant that silver coinage was now produced either by Roman authorities or under their direction and influence. It is difficult to believe that this change did not have some sort of ideological impact on how cities and their elite thought about silver coinage. I would suggest then that the emergence of cash handouts represents one manifestation of this impact. Where in the classical and Hellenistic periods it was acceptable for wealthy notables to donate large sums of money, the actual dissemination of silver coinage may have been less so long as coinage was still a product of civic authorities and their ideas about local identity. But in the early Principate, as the conceptual link between civic authority and the minting of silver coinage was weakened, it may no longer have been unacceptable for local notables to be seen to be distributing coins themselves, where this may have been previously the role of a min magistrate or an official. The early empire, moreover, was a time when the local elite became the main possessors and managers of the flow of monetary wealth in silver currency. Running of government increasingly involved private money, for example, in the phenomenon of summa honoraria, where individuals paid for benefaction as part of the holding of office. This required large expenditure and frequent expenditure as well, as it was linked to civic office holding. It's reasonable within such a context to imagine that monetary supply in the form of coin increased overall in size. But there were also larger frameworks that may have demanded more regular use of silver coin. And the last one I want to emphasize here is the fiscal demands of the Roman state. Excuse me. Here, the Augustan epoch marked a shift towards regularization. Julius Caesar had ended the regime of the publicani, tax contractors, and transferred the responsibility of taxation to the cities. But Augustus went further and universalized the census so that direct taxation reach more deeply to the level of individuals in property and poll tax. Thus, essentially, more individuals were obliged to pay tax to the Roman state, and more regularly as well than before. Moreover, we know that these taxes were demanded in silver coins and not just in commodities. Absolute comparison is impossible, but it may be that this early imperial direct taxation was more comprehensive and intrusive than under Hellenistic kings. What this development in fiscality would suggest, I think, is that euergetic cash handouts may have become popular because they were in some sense a byproduct of this more prevalent direct taxation. Obviously, a cash handout would have helped individuals towards the payment of tax, although it's also true that many handouts were given only to councillors, members of the wealthy, who would have had no problem in paying their tax. But there was possibly also a kind of psychological need. The act of distributing coins to individuals can be seen to mirror the act of the individual paying tax to the state in the form of coins, and in fact a sort of role reversal as taxpayers become coin recipients. So it is possible that cash handouts became a sort of theatrical lubrication, theatrical lubricant for the community's collective psyche to help it kind of endure the physical demands of the Roman state. The honorific inscription of Satyros of Tinos seems to suggest this, as he had donated a fund for the payment of Tinos's poll tax, but this was listed as part of his many cash handouts, which were clearly understood as a similar sort of benefaction. So to conclude, I've argued in this paper that the phenomenon of euergetic cash handouts was strictly a phenomenon of the imperial period. This was due to the changes brought about by the Principate, the rise of the role of the emperor as an ideological exemplar for the local elite, and developments in the history of silver coinage and Roman taxation that made cash handouts more possible and more symbolically relevant. These are not features that we find in the classical and Hellenistic periods, where coinage did not play such a role in civic life, or was mainly shaped by the power of civic governments and not local notables. These points do not negate the fact that significant internal changes were happening within the polis, which saw more social stratification and hierarchization, but only the idea that cash handouts should be seen as a purely endogenous internal development of the cities of Greece and Asia Minor. That is to say, finally, although cash handouts are an otherwise negligible detail of civic life, they have much to say about the complexity of the impact of Roman rule in the eastern provinces. Thank you very much.